Good evening, everyone. My name is Sven Rogge, and I'm the Dean of Science here at UNSW. It's my pleasure both as Dean, but also as a quantum physicist to welcome you to the 2023 Gerald Westheimer Lecture today, delivered by a good colleague, Professor Jeremy O'Brien. Jeremy was the CEO and co-founder of quantum computing company IQuantum, and I'm also pleased to share a graduate of UNSW. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Bedegal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to Torres Strait Islanders and Aborigines who are present here today. The mere mention of the word quantum evokes a sense of wonder, curiosity, and endless possibilities. Quantum physics with entangled particles, non-locality, and all these mind-bending concepts have captured scientists like myself for the last 100 years. Over the last 10 years, we have learned that the race to build a quantum computer is not a question of how, but just when. One person who made it his quest in life to just that is Jeremy O'Brien. His work has redefined the limits of possibility, from algorithms that promise exponential speed up to cryptography to safeguard our data with unparalleled security. Jeremy and his team have also paved the way for transformative advancement that can impact current classical technology in steps that take towards a large-scale quantum processor. There's nothing that UNSW Science likes more than celebrating stories of impact on our world, and indisputably, this is one of them. I'm proud that we're firmly embedded in this quantum revolution here at UNSW. My colleagues in the Silicon Quantum Computing and in the Dirac teams join Jeremy in his global uplift of quantum technologies. I'm therefore particularly thankful that Jeremy could share his insights here today with us and also with current students at UNSW. The Gerald Westheimer Lecture series enables eminent international researchers to deliver public talks, which we'll have today, but also spend time in residence at the university to interact with students in the departments. Unfortunately, Gerald Westheimer couldn't be here in person tonight. Nevertheless, I would like to extend my gratitude to him and thank him for his very generous gift, and I will do so in person in a few weeks' time. Without any further ado, let us delve into Jeremy's profound contributions and vision. Following the lecture, Jeremy will be joined by Tegan Taylor to discuss the work IQuantum is doing and the potential that holds for shaping our future. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Professor Jeremy O'Brien a warm welcome to the stage. Thanks, Jeremy. Look forward to it.
Well, thank you very much for that kind invitation, Sven, and it's really a privilege to be here. As Sven alluded to, I've been in the business of quantum computing for more than 25 years, and it really feels great to be giving this talk for the first time at UNSW, where it all really began for me. I was going to hand my PhD in experimental physics back in to University of New South Wales whilst I'm here if I couldn't figure out the AV, and the good news is that I'm close now. PhD in experimental physics, safe for now, but it could be revoked at any point. And yeah, there's two paths really I want to try and cover for you today in the spirit of the Westheimer lecture, which is this sort of technological scientific path, but also a bit my own path and the path of the organization that got there. And so, you know, along the way, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think may be the path to a useful quantum computer in my lifetime, and I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my journey there. Before I get going, I just want to pause for a minute I have 2 degrees from the University of New South Wales, one a science degree and one a PhD in physics. I think I was saying to someone before, I think I'm a semester away from a philosophy degree, and during my philosophy studies I had the privilege of studying history and philosophy of science and technology, very interesting subjects. And I think I want to just sort of pause for a minute and have us, think about these things that we now carry around in our pocket. And I think we humans are prone to both taking for granted the advanced technology that we have, and also lacking imagination about what more there could be to come, and they seem to be somewhat contradictory to me. And, you think about these things that I'm showing here, nuclear energy, robotics, semiconductor manufacturing, supersonic flight, genomics. These were all things of science fiction not so long ago, in living memory for some people in this room. Those things were science fiction, and they've all become reality in the last 50 years or so. And these types of innovations, and by extension I would argue a large fraction of Fortune 500 companies, car companies, material companies, energy companies, etc., were made possible thanks to human mastery of our physical world. And it's really the ability to simulate, calculate, understand, and predict the behavior of materials, chemistry, physics, and information that is really fundamentally important to bringing these technologies into reality. So, I think it's fair to say that an increasing number of people believe that quantum computing could be the single most impactful machine that humans could build in order to categorically advance our mastery of our physical world and information. And I want to just take a quick dive into one area of that. How many people here are chemists by trade or by training? Okay, so there's a few of you, and if you all rush me at once, I could be in trouble, but I suspect you'll only do it one at a time. I would contend that we can't, in fact, start to do chemistry until we have a quantum computer. That's designed to be deliberately provocative, but it's also designed to be deliberately true in the sense that if you can't simulate the building blocks of the world that you find around you, never mind the building blocks of the systems that you would like to engineer yourself, what are you really doing there? And that is what we're doing in chemistry. And if you want some sort of evidence for this outrageous claim, then you need to look no further than the world around you and life within it. We humans got given the same chemistry set that life got given. Life took, several billion years of evolution to be able to do things that make us look like absolute rank amateurs, right? The things that life can do on a chemical front. There's no, in principle, reason why we couldn't be able to do the same things. And a big impediment to that is that we can't simulate the properties of, at the molecular scale. And that's just one area that we understand increasingly well how we'll be able to use quantum computing in that. So does anyone know what this is here? Yeah, this is a quantum computer from a science fiction TV show, and you see it in the standard semi-religious type of setting, super powerful machine that's going to change the world. And the problem that I've really spent my life so far trying to solve is that quantum computing is indeed very much in the regime of science fiction. Here's what, in my opinion, is the most impressive existing quantum computer on the planet today. This is Google's system in Southern California. And on the one hand, it's really very impressive. A chip the size of your thumbnail, approximately, with about 72 qubits. So qubits are the transistors in a quantum computer. So a tiny chip of that size with just 72 qubits is able to outperform a building-scale billion-dollar supercomputer. So that's a really impressive feat. There's been some dispute about that, and Google have put more qubits into the task and settled settled that dispute, but that's a profoundly important scientific achievement. But on the other hand, you can see a problem, which is that this really looks like a science experiment that belongs in a research laboratory, that's cooled to 1/100th of the temperature of deep space and sort of wired up by hand and so on. It looks like it's born to live in a laboratory. But the real problem is that it's useless. So what you don't necessarily read about in the newspaper story that accompanies these sorts of breakthroughs is the fact that no one has figured out how to take a system of this sort of scale and deploy it for anything useful. And so if you happen to be amongst the people who know that quantum computing is at this stage of very early science fiction, it might surprise you to hear that my company, IQuantum, is today manufacturing millions of components in the flagship production line of one of the most advanced semiconductor fabrication facilities on the planet. So this that you see in this video here, this is Global Foundries Fab 8, which is in Malta, in New York. And this is the same sort of category as TSMC and Samsung and Intel. These are the factories, of which there are very few, that make the advanced chips that go into into these laptops and mobile phones and cars and everything else these days. And for a few years now, we've been building quantum devices, entangled photon sources, superconducting single photon detectors, etc., in this facility. And I just want to quickly give you an overview of how we got to that point. So, in brief, how we got from the university research environment with a researcher here with a small chip under test, manually operating things. This chip, in fact, was put on the cloud as, I think, the first quantum processor, 2-qubit processor, back in 2013. It's now in the British Science Museum next to a Babbage difference engine and an Enigma machine, which is a good place for it because it's a museum piece. It was fun, but it didn't really address the real challenges to building a utility scale system. And the sort of ethos that I had and my co-founders had and our company has to this day is to really understand this picture, which comes from my colleagues at Google, and I'll just talk you through it somewhat briefly here. So it's showing you for the size of your quantum computer, so from 1 qubit, remember they're the equivalent of the transistors in a quantum computer, so from 1 qubit to millions of qubits, and for very high quality qubits down here to very low quality qubits up here. So you can think of this as a plot of the size and quality of your quantum computer. And it's showing you what you can and can't do in various regions of this space. So for small numbers of qubits and or large error rates or poor quality qubits, you can simply simulate your quantum computer on a conventional computer. And so Google gives you a big cross here, nothing interesting to do there. And that demonstration that I just sketched of Google was crossing out of that purple region into this blue region in a demonstration of so-called quantum supremacy, so a very poor terminology developed by a very brilliant colleague of mine, John Preskill at Caltech, because what it means is that outperformance of a conventional computer that I described before. And a lot of the world of quantum computing, and I would say that UNSW has been a standout exception to this, but a lot of the world of quantum computing has been focused on how could we do something useful here. Hopefully we can do something useful, and so far no one has found anything useful to do in that regime of, let's say, 100 to 1,000 qubits. And you won't read that in the newspaper, you might not read that in the scientific paper, but it is a fact of the world that no one has a recipe for how to do something useful there. We, as a company, made a bet that, yep, all of the action is up here. You really need to be in that error-corrected regime with, therefore, of order millions of qubits and, therefore, in a Tier 1 semiconductor foundry from the start. And we were regarded as fringe lunatics for the first couple of years that we were operating as an organization, because we were just adamant that we have to head there, and we have indeed spent every minute and every cent heading in that direction. And I'm glad we did, because the way I would sort of summarize it is with this cartoon here, and those of you who know me will know that I deal mostly in glib cartoons, and those of you who don't, well, I'm telling you that now. The point here is that, you know, in some sense, these two systems do the same thing, right? Powered flight. But, you know, one is a commercial technology, and one is a proof of principle that you can demonstrate powered flight. And obviously, there's quite a few decades and probably quite a few $1 billion between these two things, and that's the gap that really needs to get closed. And I'm really gratified that the quantum computing industry is really facing up to those facts now. So I'm not going to go through this in any sort of detail, but the way my co-founder Pete likes to put it is, don't worry about the qubits. Everyone's got qubits. Everyone's had qubits for decades. The qubits are fine. People have got qubits. They're entangled. They're running gates on them. They're doing small-scale algorithms, whatever. Qubits are not the problem. The problems are the scaling challenges between dozens of qubits and millions of qubits. And I've enumerated those challenges here. I've highlighted that manufacturing component of it, and the cooling power, connectivity are reasonably self-explanatory. As you probably know, many of these quantum computing systems need to operate at very low temperatures, so you need to have a sufficient amount of cooling power to cool those systems to the temperatures that they need to operate at. And that's not challenging if those temperatures are tens of millidegrees Kelvin above absolute zero, for example. Any type of quantum computer with millions of qubits is going to be an extensive system and needs to be wired up. And you can't just use USB cables to wire up a quantum computer. You need quantum interconnects to wire it up. And then finally, a system of that scale and complexity, unsurprisingly, requires a whole bunch of conventional control electronics with it as well. And some of those control electronics need to be proximate to the qubits themselves, and therefore of a commensurate density and a compatible operating environment. These are the challenges that stand between where we are today with, you know, proofs of principle, you know, the first demonstration of powered flight, and a commercial technology. And so at PsiQuantum, we don't necessarily like the photonic approach to quantum computing, because photons make better qubits. They make great qubits. I love them as qubits, but I also love plenty of other qubits. What I really like photons for is the orders of magnitude advantages that they have in these scaling challenges. I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor of the technical issues that are being addressed. And I'll get briefly a little bit more technical here and sort of sketch to you how we envisage bringing one of those million qubit systems into reality, which is depicted here in cartoon form on the left. And you should imagine this, these cabinets, if you like, are very much like a sort of the 19-inch rack scale module, so, you know, a bit taller than me and a bit wider than me, that you would see in a data center or in a high-performance computer. That sort of scale of module is what you're looking at here. And you're looking at many dozens of them wired together in a facility that indeed looks very much like a data center. The way you get there is you take a small number of silicon photonic components, so beam splitters, single photon sources, detectors, so on. You manufacture them through the integration of a whole bunch of materials in what is now a very standard method for creating the chips that go into these things. There's a lot of complexity in being able to do that. Then you package those photonic chips up with electronic chips, and you wire that all together optically and electrically, and then you assemble those packages into those cabinets, and those cabinets into the full system. So hopefully that gives you at least a high-level overview of how these things come together. Now, at PsiQuantum, we've made millions of these components. We've made thousands of wafers of material. We've made hundreds of these packages, and we'll start assembling, I'll show you in a moment, the first of these systems this year, and then we'll begin assembling this array. And so that's why we believe that we're very close to getting this job done. So, here's a wafer with, covered in photonic components. It's mostly pretty boring from a quantum physics type of perspective, and that's how it should be from my perspective, although it's actually a truly remarkable manufacturing capability that we humans have developed. It's cost us about $1 trillion and 50 years to develop that technology. So it'd want to be pretty darn good, and it is pretty darn good. But it's also pretty standard in the sense that, we humans are producing billions of these chips with billions of components on them in a routine fashion so that they're basically a commodity that go into all of our devices and systems. And that's been our ethos as an organization, is that it should be a boring technology. It should be familiar, because if it's not, you're not very close to a real working system and a real technology. Now, there are exceptions, and I want to talk to you about one very recent one. So one of the things that we were missing was a very high-performance optical switch, so a very low-loss, very high-speed optical switch for routing photons on the chip. And what you see here is a facility that we built in San Jose. This is a molecular beam epitaxy system. It's the only 300 millimeter wafer molecular beam epitaxy system on the planet. It operates in that high manufacturing type environment, such that cassettes of 25 of those wafers can be incorporated into global foundries. It's got molten titanium in it, and things cooled to Kelvin, several Kelvin, so several degrees above absolute zero. We took a huge bet on this one, and we paid a lot of money for this facility and everything that goes in it. And we're very glad that we did, because it's just started to pay off in the second half of last year and this year, where we're now producing the most advanced optoelectronic films on the planet, and we're shipping them to global foundries, and we're making devices out of those films. And so, to zoom out for a second, we are soon then exiting the sort of semiconductor manufacturing phase of the operation of the company, if you like. You can think of the science as being done in the 20 years prior to founding this company. We've spent the last 7 years and several hundreds of millions of dollars, tackling the semiconductor engineering part of things, and we're soon to enter into the infrastructure phase of things, which is big and scary. I think I'll ask for your help on some of that large-scale infrastructure. But the point is that I'd rather have cement and concrete and kilometers of optical fiber type problems than I would, quantum physics type problems. And along the way, we're scaling up the cryogenic system. So this is what we currently use at the moment. We are able to test individual PCBs, so individual packages in those systems. We're rapidly moving on beyond that to these bigger systems that have significantly more cooling power, and we're sort of at this pace of an order of magnitude per year, if you like, on course to these cabinets. Now, I don't know about you all, but when I see these beautiful renderings, I'm often unimpressed, because I think that just shows that you know how to use a computer and you can draw a nice picture, especially in the age of AI. I think even my 12-year-old son will be doing that on a routine basis. So I'm really happy to be able to share with you that we've commandeered this retired particle accelerator in the British countryside, and using the cryogenic capability that's existing there, and we've built this system, and we're aiming to fire it up later this year. So at that point, I'm just going to pause and switch gear a little bit and tell you a little bit about how I got to the point where we have a company that's building some of the largest scale sort of cryo systems that you can hope for, and leap back to 1997, where as a undergraduate honors student at UNSW in physics, This was a cryostat that, one of many cryostats that we blew to pieces using these high explosives here in the desert in New Mexico, and which was quite something to do as an undergraduate student. And it started for me when I started my undergraduate studies at the University of Western Australia before I moved to UNSW. And in my second year of studies, I got a hold of this magazine. And that was 1995. Those of you with good eyes can see that it's dated 1994. But back in the mid-90s, it took about a year for a magazine to get to Perth. And so we got a hold of it in 95. And in this magazine is a description of how if you could harness quantum mechanics and build a quantum computer, you could bring about a revolution that would be comparable to fire or agriculture or steam power or digital revolution or something. And all of us in this quantum mechanics class thought, this is mad. Like, first of all, this is madness what we're learning in quantum mechanics. We're second year undergraduate physics students learning quantum mechanics for the first time. And wow, it could actually be not just be useful, but profoundly useful. And so I moved to the University of New South Wales, and this was one of very few and probably the only places on the planet that you could study a PhD in building a quantum computer back in those days. And this was an approach that we started way back, and that Michelle Simmons is still the world's leading exponent of back in the day. So using single phosphorus donor atoms as qubits. I got to the point where I was really obsessed with how are we going to get to 1 million qubits. We got to get to 1 million qubits, and having spent sort of 6 years on that journey, at some point I was sort of looking at all of these different approaches, and I had job offers from NEC in Japan, who had the best superconducting qubits in those days, from NTT in Japan, who had very good quantum dot qubits in those days. And I was sort of, I spent a week in both places tossing up between the two. And around that time, it was around 2000, 2001, a draft of this manuscript landed on my desk, because Gerard Milburn, who's the last author on this paper, was the deputy director of the research centre, the National Australian Research Centre in Quantum Computing, that my PhD supervisor, Bob Clark, was the director of. So I got early sight of this manuscript, which said something that was absolutely fantastical, which is that you could build a quantum computer out of photons, not out of electrons or matter-based systems or so on, but you could build a quantum computer out of photons. That was the theoretical result. So I managed to talk my way into a postdoc with this gentleman here, despite, without exaggeration, not knowing which end of a laser light was going to come out of. I got a job in a quantum optics laboratory, and that was a pretty special place, Queensland today. So Gerard, one of the authors on that paper, was there. Andrew had just returned from Los Alamos. Tim Ralph was a sort of bridge between the theory and experiment. Mike Nielsen, who the young people in the room will all have a copy of this book. And the old people in the room, I'm looking at you, Andrea, will also have a copy of this book, because it's an unusual book that is both the de facto standard textbook for undergraduate courses and also the de facto standard reference book on the topic, which is extraordinary. And these two guys are professors somewhere across the city these days, Steve Bartlett and Andrew Doherty, and Jeff was my arch collaborator. So it was special times. And we indeed made the first inroads into photonic quantum computing, demonstrating the principles of this paper. But in order to go from demonstrations that look like this to really putting it on a chip, which was the clear route to making this whole thing scalable and manufacturable, that took me to the other side of the world, to the University of Bristol, where we were able to make some real headway on that, developing this approach to integrated quantum photonics, having a lot of fun doing that, but all the time sort of being mindful that there were really big challenges that we had to tackle. And everything changed in 2015. And the way things changed in 2015, so I had been at it for about 20 years at that point. And, you know, this is, you know, my thesis, which was shared by plenty of other folk here at UNSW back in the mid to late 90s and to this day, was that we're just not going to, it's just not going to happen in my lifetime unless we figure out how to leverage the semiconductor industry. Because otherwise, you're going to have to spend a good fraction of those 50 years and a good fraction of $1 trillion at least to create an equivalent manufacturing capability. And in 2015, we had an architecture that we believed satisfied that requirement. In the short history of the company is we spent the first several years and several $100 million actually getting into one of those tier 1 semiconductor foundries, and now we've been working with them for several years, and we're close to starting to, you know, pour the concrete to build that facility that I've sketched for you. I won't say much more about the journey along the way of starting a company. This is an early photo that brings fond memories to me. This is the entire company, and of course, as you go from, you know, 0 to, you know, several hundred people, obviously you need a bigger and bigger room to fit everyone in a wider and wider lens. But the more important thing is that there's an incredible people story associated with all of this technology. I want to finish with a non-people story, the anti-people story. So this is a piece of automated test equipment. It's pretty standard in the semiconductor industry. And I had fantasies about this equipment for many years when I was a professor of physics. And what you can see it's doing here is it's taking cassettes full of 25 silicon wafers. Each of those wafers is covered with hundreds of chips before they're, you know, diced up and, you know, turned into individual chips. It loads those things automatically. It comes along, it tests all of the components on them. It maps out the performance of these things. And when the first one of these things arrived, I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and I estimated that it does the job of about 100,000 graduate students, one of these machines. I think that was before we put the auto cassette loader on it. We soon got a second machine. We've just got another 4 of 6 of these things arriving. And this is both sort of an incredible transformation from my perspective, from being in a research lab, you know, myself or my grad students doing things by hand, to using the state-of-the-art tools of industry. And it's also absolutely necessary, because if you're going to build a system with millions to billions of components, you're going to need to test billions of components along the way. And if you're going to do that by hand, one by one, that's going to take a very long time indeed. And so it's very exciting to, you know, be able to do a lot of that work here. And so I just, for me, it's one of those moments in history that I'll just never forget, walking in and seeing one of these things in our facility. And now, of course, they're just a sort of like a coffee machine, just a routine thing that people do. All right, I think I've used more time than I would have liked, but let me stop there and thank you for your attention and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Your degree is safe for now, but there's a second part. I would like now to invite the health and science reporter from the ABC, Tegan Taylor, to join me on stage. If you are an ABC listener like I am, you would know Tegan from her amazing award-winning podcast, CoronaCast, and also as a co-host of the National Health Report and her live event series, Occam's Razor. Please.
Thanks, Sven. I guess the first question, Jeremy, is why do you have to come at the chemists like that? It's not unfair.
You know, I actually think it's crazy exciting. Like, I wish I were a chemist in that situation, right? And you know, obviously we have all sorts of wonderful things that we've done in chemistry, but you see that the potential is vast. And I hope that made sense, this analogy with life, right? Like photosynthesis, you know, nitrogen fixation, reproduction, right? Like all of these things are driven by chemistry that we don't have a hope of understanding, never mind replicating to our own desire. And I think it's a very, very exciting time to certainly, okay, there's a lot more to chemistry than just the computational part of things, and it's deliberately provocative, as I said.
I do want to get to the massive computational power of quantum and the sort of applications that has, but about you first, like before you founded IQuantum, you were professor of physics at Stanford, Bristol, you're the director of the Centre for Quantum Photonics. What sort of clinched your decision to leave academia and go into the commercialisation side of things?
I was at Stanford for a short period, but that was just a cover story for starting a company. I enjoyed my time in academia, but it was always for a purpose, which was to make as much progress as possible towards this, what I think is a really exciting, like, you know, I've been excited for 25 years in an increasing level, and that's because, as you allude to, the transformative applications of that technology. And so I sort of transformed from physicist to engineer to technologist to, I would argue now that I'm more of a business person than anything else. Now I draw upon my technical expertise and background. And so for me, that the leap, and I was saying it to someone earlier, just before this session, it wasn't a leap at all. In fact, it's the other way around. In 2015, once we had that, we had what we believed was the magic recipe that the four of us had been searching for 10 to 20 years each. It just seemed crazy to not do it. And indeed, I had people, when I moved out to California, I had people saying to me, wow, you gave up a tenured position at a university, and I sort of saw the risk the other way around, which is that you'd die pretty sad and miserable, wondering what might have happened if you didn't try it and you didn't do it.
I mean, this would have been the same if you'd stayed at university, but the thing that you've really had to do is sell that concept. Like, you can see it, you can see the excitement, but sell that to investors and say, like, we're looking at those facilities, you said some really big numbers just before. How do you convey that to the sort of people you need to get on board?
Yeah, it's I don't know what quantities you put into the recipe, but there's absolutely some vision, but there's also a lot of technical depth to that. And the way I used to describe it in the early days was, smart investors would take my advice, or they'd come to it themselves, which is chop the whole thing in half. Like, no one on this planet can say whether we can build a functioning quantum computer, but if you chop the thing in half, and it's funny, I don't see Bob Clark, my PhD supervisor, here, and I hope he won't mind this anecdote, but back in the day, he used to say, can we build it and will it work? And I, being a cynical, know-it-all grad student back in the day, say, yeah, I can build it out of Lego this afternoon. It won't work. I'm not sure that they're separate questions from one another. But actually, I then, ironically, came to see that as exactly the right two questions for an investor to ask. Can you build it? That's a semiconductor engineering question. And, I would have people that we were trying to recruit say, I reckon it's going to take 5 years and cost, $250 million, having, done an assessment of it, to which I would respond, would you mind writing that and sign it? Like someone of your stature saying it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time, but it's a quantum computer at the end. It's not an accelerator for machine learning that gives you a 2x or a 10x or even a 1,000x performance. It gives you exponentially greater performance, essentially, for some really important applications. And so I think if you think about, okay, you've got to build this thing, and then as a separate question, if you build that thing, will it function as a quantum computer? And that question is actually quite easy to answer if you know how to answer it. And there's not many people who know how to answer it that don't work in IQuantum, so it's hard. But, it's not controversial amongst, do you know what I mean, amongst that crowd of people? So, yeah, you have to understand how the architecture works and so on and so forth. So that was really, I think, the way to communicate the reality of it. And it was, I have to say, I have several colleagues from the quantum computing world here at UNSW who could comment similarly on this, but it's an interesting field, right? Because you've got, and unfortunately I skipped that slide, but you've got a multitude of different ways that you can make qubits, and they're really diverse, right? You'd need many PhDs in physics to be able to really speak with authority on all of them. And I think universally everyone thinks that their approach is way better than everyone else's. And in academia, I found you're preaching to the unconvertible, right, to a large extent. And by contrast, when you're talking to investors and particularly, sort of semiconductor people, they're really assessing, right, like, can you build that thing? And then they're deferring probably to, people from the university research world back in those days, whether it'll work once you've built it. And so I found it a much more receptive audience, actually, than academia in that way.
How much, you've staked everything on the end game. That's sort of what you're famous for. PsiQuantum's the best funded quantum startup in the world. You've obviously managed to convince people of it. But how much pressure do you get from investors and other interested parties about showing something interim?
Yeah, I think we have got a little bit of pressure about that along the way, but actually we do show a lot of, and this is an interesting distinction between obviously my lives in the academic world and the company world, is that as far as I'm concerned, if you're a professor of physics or engineering and you're using taxpayer money to fund your research, then you have an obligation to proactively explain to those people what you're doing with their money. And I took that very seriously when I was a university professor, and I would rage at my academic colleagues who would say things like, "Oh, I don't talk to journalists." What do you mean you don't talk to? You're obliged to do that. And furthermore, not just when they call you up, but actively. And then, of course, in a privately held company, your obligations are to the shareholders of that company, not just the investors, but in a typical tech startup, all of the employees of the company as well. And so the need to demonstrate those milestones is largely an internal one. That's the first thing. So we have indeed, as I've sort of shown some of here, we have indeed built systems and prototypes and so on, but we took I think we took a very contrarian path very deliberately from the beginning, which was to go for the end goal, because we were just clear that there was almost certainly nothing valuable to do in those smaller things, and that was based on good science. My co-founder Terry Rudolph invented the very earliest ideas of boson sampling, which is a way to demonstrate quantum supremacy that the Chinese research groups demonstrated just a year or two after Google did. My co-founder Pete and I, we co-invented the variational quantum eigensolver with our colleagues at Harvard and implemented it on a chip in 2012 or something, which is an algorithm for doing those quantum chemistry type applications on one of those small noisy systems, and it looks very exciting, and indeed has been essentially the poster child of that regime and the hope for that regime. And it has just one quite big problem, which is it doesn't work. You can't do anything useful with it so far as anyone knows. And now, can I prove that you can't do anything useful? Absolutely not. It's very hard to prove the non-existence of things, and it's essentially impossible to prove anything whatsoever in computer science. So and by the way, when we started the company, we I think it was fair enough to regard us as fringe lunatics, because there was much better reason for optimism that something useful could be found. Like, it's appealing, right? Like, you've got a thumbnail-sized chip, right, that does something in whatever it is, minutes, that this billion-dollar building-scale supercomputer cannot do in hundreds of thousands of years, right? It's got to be useful. Now, I used to 5, 6, 7 years ago, I used to say, well, there are also molecules in my coffee cup that you can't simulate on a conventional computer. But I didn't say I've got a supercomputer in my coffee cup. Now, that's actually not so facetious an analogy there to sort of get a sense of, yeah, it does seem pretty appealing. It is obviously very attractive if you can make something work. And it could still happen that someone finds something useful to do in that regime. I think the optimism has just decreased over time about that. And I think now the consensus is that the emerging consensus is that you really need millions of qubits to do anything useful. And that's obviously a completely different world from making hundreds or thousands of qubits. And that's why really it's that early bet that we made that was very different. Because, again, a glib sort of cartoon picture here is that, well, if you think that the task is to get to the top of the Empire State Building and you've got a 10-foot ladder, then you just start building longer and longer ladders, and you're making progress, and if you can just make this work. But if you actually realize that the goal is the moon, then you can forget about ladders and you can start work on designing rocket engines and testing different types of fuel, building a fuselage. And as, again, my co-founder Pete likes to say, if I want to go to the moon, I'd much rather have a rocket engine that doesn't yet get off the ground than a very tall ladder. And again, it's sort of, but the point is that it takes you in a very different direction from the start. And so we could have done demonstrations of quantum supremacy and boson sampling and small-scale things, but another way to say it is we kind of got that out of our system in the academic days as well.
Well, let's talk about the potential, because so I'm a science reporter and a health reporter, and whenever I've done a story on quantum physics or quantum computing, I always have to spend the first 3/4 of the story explaining gates and qubits, and the end is big numbers.
Yeah.
So let's talk, we've got all that out of the way. What kind of applications are we talking about here? You're going to solve climate change, right?
Yeah. I will do that, and I'll also share some good news with you, which is that those days are ending for you and all other journalists very soon, because what we humans do is we get obsessed with how nascent technologies work, and then once we've had them for a while, we don't worry about it. And I found myself in Davos many times over the last decade, and everyone there is a genius because they wouldn't be there otherwise. And if you can't explain to a genius how a quantum computer works in 10 seconds, then that's on you. And anyway, I got into this habit of saying, "Do you know how a transistor works?" And then people would start to look scared, and I'd say, "Don't worry, I'm not gonna test you on it. But do you know how many are in here? What, like a billion? Yeah, billions of transistors in there. And how complicated do you think a system with billions of components is? Never mind the telecommunication system that maybe even encrypts it if you're using WhatsApp to post a selfie from the top of the mountain to your friends back home. How complicated do you think that thing is? And by the way, there are plenty of people driving around in internal combustion, not you and I, obviously.
No, of course not. In
internal combustion engine cars that don't understand how those things work. And you can fly on an airplane fine without knowing how a turbofan engine works, right? Someone has to understand it, and that's sort of what we humans are very, very good at, is collectively understanding things, having people understand things. And there's a claim that's probably a decade or more old, that there's no single individual who's capable of understanding end to end how one of the chips in this thing works, right? And so I think that it's the wrong question to ask how things work. And your question, which I'll now answer, having answered a different question, or refuse to answer a different question that you didn't ask, is what will it do for me, and when's it happening, right? That's the sort of thing.
Go on then.
And I mentioned this chemistry example quite robustly, as you pointed out, And the reason that I highlight that example is because I think it's one of the biggest, earliest, most impactful things. And if you think about it, everything requires a chemical, a chemistry explanation at its heart. If you go down far enough, you need to understand chemistry, and that's true whether you're trying to design a new molecule that will serve as a pharmaceutical, trying to understand how that molecule will interact with a target or a non-target in the human body, design a material that's biocompatible, design a catalyst that you could cheaply and easily mass produce to suck gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere and turn into something useful like a fuel or a plastic or a material. I'll give you a very concrete example of an application which I like. I don't really know what the full market implications of this are, but it's become topical in the last year or two, and that's the process by which we get nitrogen into our bodies. The billions of us on this planet now, depending on how organic your diet is, up to half of the nitrogen in your body, which is the fourth most abundant element in your body, was made in a factory in a high temperature, high pressure process. And that process was invented in 1910, Haber-Bosch process. It consumes a few percent of the world's energy production to get to those high temperatures and pressures, and a few percent of the world's natural gas production to source the hydrogen. So basically you take nitrogen from the atmosphere, the air is mostly nitrogen, and it's very strongly bonded into N2 molecules. So at high temperature and high pressure, you sort of split them apart, and you add 3 hydrogen atoms to each nitrogen atom, and you get ammonia, NH3. And that's the fertilizer that we for 50-some years, the Green Revolution, and we couldn't feed half the world's population in the ways that we farm, at least today, without that process. Now, never mind the environmental imperative for doing better, and that's a lot of energy and a lot of natural gas. I had a great argument with someone about natural gas and energy being the same thing. So if anyone's up for that afterwards, I'm not up for it. The point is that we should be able to do better, and we haven't been able to do better for more than 100 years. And yet we know you can do better because there are microbes in the soil doing the same thing, like taking nitrogen from the air and making it available to plants. And they're not operating at high temperature and high pressure. They're operating at ambient pressure. And what's more, they're taking hydrogen from water, not from natural gas. And we can get in there with our electron microscope and we can have a look at those nitrogenase enzymes, which is the biological name for catalysts, and they're typically very big, complex molecules that evolution has engineered over billions of years. So we know that there's a better way to do it. We cannot simulate that nitrogenase enzyme, not even the sort of, we have an inkling of this, this iron molybdenum complex part of it that facilitates this operation, and yet we haven't figured it out how that works exactly, which is very hard to then reverse engineer and then create your own thing. That's the sort of thing that you might want to do. Now I'll give you a very specific example because I think it's hopefully helpful to people to see something concrete, and actually that catalyst for sucking carbon out of the air, which we have to do, right? Like I hope that everyone in the world is aware that not only do we have to reduce emissions very dramatically, very quickly, but we also have to have negative emissions, and we have no economic technology for that. And I want to make sure that I say this quickly. Please don't go away from tonight's lecture with any sense that quantum computing is going to ride to the rescue and solve climate change. Assume that it is not, and do everything that you can personally and within your organizations to tackle that problem. And as I've said to plenty of people, we humans have had all of the technology that we have needed to solve climate change for decades, what we've lacked is the political, social, and economic will to implement those technological solutions. And the role of technology, more technology, whether it's quantum computing and indeed quantum computing is sort of an enabler of a multitude of technologies, the role of technologies is to ease all of those things to make it, particularly economically easier to implement. But we need to do it regardless, and we need to do everything in parallel. If you have inklings for how you might use a quantum computer to tackle things like that catalyst, like better electric batteries, green hydrogen production, cement and steel production, et cetera, would love to talk to you.
But let's say it is part of the solution for climate change. Will it be ready in time? What kind of timeframes are we looking at?
Yeah, so that is so we launched we launched an initiative called Climate with a Q, which is focused on the climate applications of quantum computing, and we did an analysis of about 150 different use cases of quantum computing, so technologies that could be accelerated by quantum computing, and we sort of prioritized those that would be both most accelerated by quantum computing and have the biggest CO2 equivalent impact, and we reckon it's in the gigatons on the sort of end of the decade time frame, and in the tens of gigatons by the sort of middle of the next decade time frame. Of course, the impact will be precisely zero if you don't have a quantum computer. So quantum computing, so first and foremost build the quantum computer, but also in parallel with that, be ready to deploy it for these applications, and there's deep technical work to be done as well as supply chain and economic work to be done around these things. So for example, if we're going to suck gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere, I think we're going to have to stand up thousands of global air filters, which will certainly be a public-private partnership type of thing. I would only imagine involve oil and gas majors contributing to the infrastructure around these things and so on. So there's plenty to be doing to get ready. But I make my point again. We can't. Yes, I believe that quantum computing can be part of the solution. I believe that we are on course to deliver systems of the scale needed on the time frame that is needed. But I also urge everyone to not be leaning on that at all, right? Like we need to solve this thing in a real hurry.
So when it's ready, who gets it? Like, you're going to build a computer. Like, who gets this technology first when it's actually ready to be deployed?
Well, one of the things that we've done is commit a huge fraction of our early capacity for those climate-related applications, I personally, and I think I speak for my three co-founders as well, we didn't start a company in Silicon Valley because we thought it would be cool to be, startup kids and all the rest of it. We did it, I think, first and foremost because we felt a moral responsibility to bring this technology that we had worked on for a very long time and indeed consumed a lot of public money to do that. We did it because we felt a moral responsibility to bring it into reality, and therefore to bring it to bear on some of the grand challenges that we face, and climate is certainly first and foremost, and I would say then followed soon thereafter by things like healthcare and energy that falls outside of climate and so on. But the reason that you asked the question, implicit in that, is that there will be quite a limited supply of this quantum computing resource, and that's one thing that we're determined to do to deploy it for the most impactful applications.
Yeah. We're not taking questions from the audience tonight, but many people did actually submit questions beforehand. And just sort of following on from that, one is from Vedant, who's a UNSW student, saying, how financially affordable will a quantum computer be? Will it be something accessible for everyone, or will it be quite exclusive?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm determined that we do our bit to distribute the benefits more equitably than we humans have done so with technology in the past. And you know, this is my personal view on things. I find it remarkable that we didn't distribute these things to, let's say, the continent of Africa, you know, a decade or more before we did, on the basis that, as far as I'm concerned, we all win if we have a healthier, you know, better educated, more technologically literate population on the planet, right? Like, it seems that there's no downside to that, and indeed, we're seeing the downside to the unequal distribution of the benefits of technology, and I think we're at risk of more of that. And then, sort of specifically, it's not, you know, it's one of those things where, let's say, so, you know, we've done work with Mercedes-Benz that's in the public domain. I think we've got something out recently with a pharmaceutical company. You know, you don't necessarily, the generic citizen of the planet, don't necessarily want access to a quantum computer. What you want access to is the products that have been enabled by that quantum computer. Like, you want that better electric battery, and you also want everyone else to be using that better electric battery so that we can electrify not just the transport system, but the entire global economy. So that's, and I think that's quite, it's quite realistic to think in those terms. And indeed, you know, we've had those discussions, particularly in the climate context, about, you know, impact and scale and who the right partners are to bring those things into reality for exactly that reason.
Just finally, you showed the magazine cover before from 1994.
Yeah.
Where are we going to be in another 30 years? What kind of conversations are we having then?
Yeah, it's a great. I mean, if you talk about just quantum computing, I think we will get new levels of mastery over the physical world, right? Like, I used to sort of talk about, you know, graphene, right? Like this wonder material. I don't know if everyone's forgotten about it now. I think it's one of those things where it's incorporated into too many products and, you know, people have forgotten. But it's this sort of miracle material, right? Like a single atomic layer thick, you know, carbon thing that was sort of, you know, dreamed up theoretically and then chanced upon, whatever. As far as I'm concerned, we need to deterministically engineer wonder materials like that for our future technologies, so that, you know, we can go find this thing in 30 years' time in the Computer History Museum, which, if anyone's ever in Silicon Valley, you should go check that out. It's a great place to go, and look at it and say, oh, isn't it quaint, right? Like, it's got this chassis. Like, half of the thing doesn't even do anything. It's just a structured thing. It's got this battery in it that's, you know, sits in there. Like, but we should have wonder materials that are multifunctional, you know, harvesting energy, you know, part of the communication systems, and so on. And, you know, if we maintain the trajectory that we're on technologically, I think that will happen. And you know, quantum computing will put a big bend in that curve, actually, and you know, takes me all the way back round to that chemistry provocation, right? Like, imagine what you could do if you could do chemistry. Like, life can do chemistry, right? Like, imagine that.
It's a crazy world. You're painting a picture for us, Jeremy. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Tegan. Thank you, Jeremy. I was very impressed by the journey from the quirky ideas in academia to a massive startup company that you told us. The challenge to the chemists, you definitely pissed them off. I think it's a very interesting idea, the chemistry by design, and what will come from that. They're watching this space very carefully.
Absolutely.
Now. I'm very reassured to see the advances in quantum technologies, classical technologies that IQuantum is doing. So the impact that will come before you actually have the quantum computer that are financially viable. And finally, I think it's very good that both you reminded us about the climate urgency and that we cannot wait for a quantum computer. It may help, But that's, if it comes a bit too late, we're all in deep trouble. Thank you both for that. Yes. So this concludes this evening. I thank you all very much for joining us for this exciting event, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.